The letter arrived on a Tuesday, which Harvey Brooks would later say was the worst day of the week for a man's life to be upended, and he was not wrong about that. It was the spring of 1878, and the town of Calico Ridge, Texas, sat baking under a sun that had no mercy and no manners, sprawled along a flat stretch of dusty earth where the wind blew hot from the south, and the cattle outnumbered the people by a count that nobody had ever bothered to tally. Harvey Brooks was 31 years old, broad-shouldered and lean in the way that men who worked cattle from sunup to sundown tended to get, with calloused hands and sun-darkened skin, and a jaw that had not seen a razor in 4 days. He owned 312 acres of land northwest of town, a herd of 78 longhorns, a horse named General who had a bad temper and excellent instincts, and a farmhouse that his father had built in 1861 that needed new boards on the porch and a fresh coat of whitewash on the south-facing wall but was otherwise sound. What Harvey Brooks did not have, and what he had made extraordinarily clear to everyone in Calico Ridge who had ever entertained the thought of mentioning it, was a wife. He did not want one. That was the simple truth of it, stated plainly and without apology whenever the subject arose, which it arose more frequently than any reasonable man should have had to tolerate. His neighbor Hector Dubois, who ran sheep on the adjacent property, and therefore already had one strike against him in Harvey's estimation, had suggested it 3 times in the past year. Old Pastor Emmett Rowe had hinted at it from the pulpit in a sermon about the loneliness of the righteous that Harvey felt was rather specifically aimed, given that he had been the only unmarried man over 25 in the congregation that particular Sunday. Even his own ranch hand, a young man of 20 named Cody Price who had more opinions than experience warranted, had brought it up once and been told in no uncertain terms to occupy himself with mending fences rather than Harvey's domestic arrangements. Harvey's reasons were his own, and he kept them close. He had watched his father work himself raw for a family, had watched his mother go pale and thin with the labor of the frontier, had watched the love between 2 people stretch and crack under the weight of hard seasons and harder years. His father had died in 1869, his mother in 1872, and Harvey had inherited the land and the cattle and the solitude, and found, to his own considerable surprise, that the solitude was not a burden. It was a relief. There was a clean simplicity to a life without entanglement. He knew what he had to do each day, and he did it, and at night he cooked his own supper and read by the light of a kerosene lamp, and went to bed when he felt like it and woke before dawn without anyone to answer to or account for. He was not unhappy. That was the part that everyone in Calico Ridge could not seem to accept, could not seem to believe, as though a man living alone without a woman in the house was by definition a man in a state of misery requiring remedy. Harvey was not miserable. He was settled. He was clear. His life fit him the way a good boot fits after enough years of wearing, and he had no particular desire to break in a new one. And then the letter arrived. It came on a Tuesday in early April, carried in the leather saddlebag of the male rider, a young man named Pete Garrison, who made the run between Calico Ridge and the larger town of Abilene twice a week, and who handled other people's correspondence with the casual lack of discretion that came from spending too much time alone on horseback. Pete handed Harvey the envelope across the counter of the general store where Harvey had stopped to buy flour and salt and a new tin of coffee, and he said, with entirely too much interest, "That one came all the way from Philadelphia, Mr. Brooks. Fancy handwriting on it, too." Harvey looked at the envelope. His name was written across the front in a hand that was precise and slightly old-fashioned, the letters looping in a way that suggested whoever had written it had been properly schooled. His address was there, and the return address in the upper left corner read simply, M. Finley, 14 Granger Street, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. He did not know any M. Finley. He put the envelope in his coat pocket, finished his purchases, loaded the flour and coffee onto General's saddlebag, and rode home. He unsaddled General and brushed him down and fed him and checked the water trough and repaired a section of fence along the east pasture where 2 of the young steers had been testing the wire, and then he ate supper, which was salt pork and beans cooked over the iron stove, and he washed his dish and hung it on the hook, and he sat down at the table with the kerosene lamp and the letter, and looked at it for a long minute before he opened it. The paper inside was cream-colored and finely textured. It had been folded with care. He unfolded it and smoothed it against the table and read, "Dear Mr. Brooks," the letter began, and he read the whole of it straight through, and then he sat back in his chair and stared at the lamp flame for a while, and then he picked the letter up and read it again. He read it 7 times before he went to bed that night. The letter was from a woman named Margaret Finley. She was 27 years old, a schoolteacher who had been employed at a private girls' school in Philadelphia for the past 4 years. She explained in language that was direct without being cold, recently found herself in a position of financial uncertainty. Her employer, the school's headmistress, had retired, and the new headmistress had her own preferred staff, and had informed Margaret that her position would not be renewed at the end of the spring term. She had no family remaining in Philadelphia, her parents having both died in the past 3 years, her father of a fever and her mother of grief, if Margaret was being honest, which she seemed inclined to be. She had a younger brother in St. Louis who was making his own way and could not accommodate her. She had savings, but they were modest, and Philadelphia was not a modest city to live in without steady income. She had seen Harvey's name, she explained, through a mutual acquaintance. This required some explanation. The acquaintance was a Mrs. Dorothea Sparks, who had married a cattleman from Calico Ridge named Tom Sparks in 1875, and moved west and written to Margaret every few months with detailed accounts of frontier life that Margaret described as honest enough to be alarming and interesting enough that she kept reading. Mrs. Sparks had mentioned Harvey in one of her letters as a man of good standing and steady character, who owned land and cattle, and had made no secret of his intention to remain unmarried, which Mrs. Sparks seemed to consider a personal affront to the natural order of things. Mrs. Sparks had apparently included Harvey's address in her letter to Margaret, along with the comment that someone ought to change the man's mind before he turned into a piece of furniture. Margaret Finley wrote that she had not sent the letter to change his mind. She wanted to be clear about that, and Harvey noticed, reading it over again the 3rd time, that she underlined the word clear with a firm hand that pressed through to the back of the paper. She was not writing to trap him or manipulate him or present herself as something she was not. She was writing because she was a practical woman in a practical situation, and she wanted to be honest about it. She could teach. She could keep a household. She had no illusions about the difficulty of frontier life, having read Dorothea's letters with attention. She was not afraid of hard work. She was not, she admitted in a sentence that Harvey found unexpectedly affecting in its plainness, entirely sure why she was writing this letter except that she had sat in her room in Philadelphia on a rainy Sunday in March and thought about the next 10 years of her life and felt something very close to terror, and terror had seemed like a reasonable prompt to try something new. She was not asking him to say yes, she wrote. She was asking him if he was willing to write back, just to write back. She did not want to come to Texas as a stranger. She wanted, if anything came of this correspondence, to come as someone he had at least chosen to talk to. She thought a person deserved that much. She thought he deserved that much too. She had signed it, with genuine respect and no small amount of nerves, Margaret Finley. Harvey read that closing 7 times, and each time something happened in his chest that he could not entirely account for. He told himself it was the salt pork sitting wrong. He put the letter in the top drawer of the small desk in the corner of the main room, the drawer where he kept the deed to the land and his father's watch and the few things he considered worth keeping, and he went to bed, and he lay in the dark listening to the wind move across the flat Texas land and thought about a woman sitting in a room in Philadelphia on a rainy Sunday in March feeling something very close to terror, and he found that he could not stop thinking about it, which was inconvenient. He wrote back after 4 days of not writing back, which was 4 days of telling himself he was not going to write back. He wrote 2 drafts and threw them both into the stove because they sounded either too formal or too eager, neither of which he particularly wanted to sound. And the 3rd draft he wrote at the kitchen table at 6 in the morning before he had done anything else, and he sent it before he thought about it too long, because thinking about it too long was clearly not serving him. He told her he had received her letter and read it with interest. He told her, because honesty seemed to be the operating principle of this particular correspondence, that he had not been looking for anyone and had no plans to be. He told her that his land was good but that the work was relentless and the summers were brutal, and the winters were not much better, and that anyone who came to Texas expecting something romantic and picturesque was going to be disappointed. He told her he was sorry about her parents. He wrote that last sentence and then sat looking at it for a while, because it was the most personal thing he had put on paper in years. He left it in. He told her he was willing to write back if she was. He signed it, H. Brooks. Then he crossed out the H and wrote Harvey. Then he stared at that for a moment and left it. She wrote back in less than 2 weeks, which given the distance meant she had written back almost immediately. She thanked him for his honesty and matched it with her own. She said she appreciated that he had told her about the summers because Dorothea's letters had mentioned the heat, and she wanted to know if Dorothea had been understating it or overstating it. And Harvey wrote back that Dorothea had likely been understating it, and provided specific details about the summer of 1876 that had killed 11 head of cattle and kept the temperature above 100 degrees for 19 consecutive days. And something about the act of describing it made him write more than he intended. 3 full pages about the land and the cattle and the particular way the light fell across the flat terrain in the late afternoon, golden and enormous, filling the sky from edge to edge with a color that had no name in English as far as he could tell. He sent the letter and then sat at his table in the quiet and thought that he had not talked about the afternoon light in this place to anyone, ever. He was not entirely sure he had even thought about it consciously before, had only ever noticed it in the peripheral way of a man who is too busy working to stop and look at things. And now he had written 3 pages about it to a woman in Philadelphia who was a stranger. He decided not to examine that too closely. Their letters overlapped sometimes, crossing each other in transit, so that he would receive a letter asking about the cattle market and realize he had just sent one answering a question she had not yet asked. There was something pleasant about that, he admitted to himself cautiously. Something that felt like conversation, which he was not used to finding pleasant. He was a man who spoke when there was something to say and was otherwise content with silence, but the letters were not loud in the way that conversation could be. They were quiet and considered because both of them wrote thoughtfully, and he found that he could take his time with them, carry them in his pocket, read them again on the ride out to check the herd, and think about what he wanted to say back. Margaret Finley, it turned out, had opinions. She had opinions about cattle, which surprised him, having apparently read enough agricultural pamphlets out of what she described as sheer determination to understand the life she was considering, that she had developed views on the relative merits of different grazing practices. She had opinions about the role of public education on the frontier, and these opinions were expressed with a clarity and force that Harvey found himself reading twice to make sure he had absorbed them properly. She had opinions about books, and these differed from his in interesting ways that led to a 3-letter exchange about whether a novel could be called excellent if the ending was unsatisfying, Harvey holding that it could not and Margaret arguing with considerable wit that the quality of a journey was not determined by whether the destination was comfortable. She made him laugh. He was sitting at the table reading a letter in which she described a disastrous attempt to cook something she called a Welsh rarebit on a small gas burner in her rooming house, a description so precisely comic in its specificity. The landlady's expression, the smell, the smoke, the neighbor banging on the wall, that he laughed out loud in his empty kitchen, and the sound surprised him, because he had not heard it in that house in a long time. He wrote back and told her about the time he had tried to shoe General on his own, before he had learned the proper technique, and the sequence of events that followed was not something he had ever intended to share with another living person. But he shared it with her, and her response was warm and laughing, and she also gently noted that General sounded like a horse with a great deal of self-respect, which Harvey felt was entirely accurate. Cody Price noticed that Harvey was receiving letters from back east. Cody noticed most things and could be relied upon not to keep them to himself. He mentioned it one morning while they were working to repair a section of the north fence line, driving new posts into the hard earth, and Harvey told him flatly that it was none of his business, and Cody said, with the bright-eyed confidence of a young man who has not yet been wrong enough times to develop appropriate caution, "Is it a woman, Mr. Brooks?" Harvey drove a fence post into the ground with perhaps more force than strictly necessary. Cody Price grinned and wisely said nothing further for the remainder of the morning. Hector Dubois, however, was not as easily redirected. He appeared at Harvey's fence line on a late April afternoon, riding a fat roan mare and wearing the expression of a man who has heard something and requires confirmation, and he leaned over the fence and said, "Tom Sparks tells me his wife has been writing to some lady back east about you." "Dorothea Sparks," Harvey said without looking up from the wire he was tightening, "can write to whomever she pleases. Word is this lady wrote to you." "Word," Harvey said, "travels too fast in this town." "Did she?" Harvey looked up at Hector Dubois with the level regard of a man who has survived 312 acres and 78 longhorns and 19 consecutive days above 100 degrees. "What she wrote and what I intend to do about it," Harvey said, "is between me and my conscience and nobody else." Hector Dubois, who had known Harvey Brooks for 12 years and had never once successfully extracted information that Harvey did not want to give, nodded slowly and rode back to his sheep. But the truth was that Harvey had already been thinking, very carefully and without rushing, about what he intended to do. The letters had been going back and forth for 2 months now. May was coming in warm and the land was greening in the little ways it greened before the brutal summer arrived, and Harvey had received Margaret's most recent letter that morning and read it twice in the barn, while General watched him with suspicious dark eyes. In the letter she had talked about the end of the school term approaching, which meant the end of her position, which meant a reckoning that she had been preparing herself for but had not yet fully arrived at. She said she was not afraid, and then she crossed that out and wrote, "I am a little afraid," and crossed that out too and wrote, "I am afraid," and left it. Just that. "I am afraid." And then she said that she appreciated, more than she could properly express, that he had written back, and that whatever happened, she was glad to know him. Whatever happened. Harvey sat at his kitchen table that night with a glass of water and the letter and the lamp, and thought about whatever happened for a long time. And then he thought about a woman crossing out her admissions of fear and writing them back in again, because she was someone who told the truth even when it was uncomfortable. And he thought about the word glad. She was glad to know him. And he thought about the way she had described the afternoon light in his letter back to her, that she had read that passage 3 times and said it made her feel as though she could see it. And he thought about 27 years old, and I am afraid in Philadelphia on a rainy Sunday in March, and the next 10 years of her life. He picked up his pen. He wrote, "Miss Finley, I am going to say something that I did not expect to say when I wrote my first letter to you, and I want to say it plainly because plain language has served us both well in this correspondence. I would like you to come to Calico Ridge, not as a stranger, not as a woman fulfilling an arrangement, but as someone I have talked to for 2 months and found to be the most interesting person I have corresponded with in my adult life, which is not saying nothing, because I have corresponded with my banker and he is a very dull man. I cannot promise you easy. I can promise you honest. I can promise you that I will be straight with you about everything, the same way you have been straight with me. I have 312 acres and a bad-tempered horse, and a porch that needs new boards and a kitchen that is serviceable and a lamp that needs a new wick and a life that I have been told is lonely, though I never found it so until I started looking at it through the eyes of someone who asked good questions about it. If you want to come, I will meet you in Abilene. If you do not want to come, I will understand it and wish you well, and I mean that sincerely. He signed it, Harvey Brooks. Then he picked up the pen again and wrote below the signature, in smaller letters, I am glad to know you too. He posted it the next morning and then went and worked until he was too tired to think about whether he had said too much or not enough. Her response came 2.5 weeks later, which was faster than usual, and he stood in the general store with Pete Garrison looking at him with barely concealed excitement, and held the envelope for a moment before he opened it, because once he opened it there would be a yes or a no, and at the moment there was still the suspended state of neither. He opened it. She had written, yes, I will come. I will arrive in Abilene on the 14th of June, if that suits. I have been sitting here reading your letter at my small desk in my room, and the lamp is low and it is raining again, which seems to be what Philadelphia does when I am making important decisions, and I have been trying to think of all the reasons this is impractical and unwise, and I find that I keep arriving back at the same place, which is that I want to go, and I have spent too much of my life not going the places I wanted to go because going felt uncertain. I am tired of certainty. I want to see the afternoon light. And then in smaller letters below her signature, I expect the lamp wick will need replacing when I get there. I am good with lamps. Harvey Brooks stood in the Calico Ridge General Store and felt something move through him that was so unfamiliar he almost did not recognize it. It took him a full 30 seconds to identify it as joy. He bought the flour and salt and coffee that were his ostensible purpose for being in town, and he rode home, and he spent the rest of the afternoon sitting on the porch that needed new boards and looking at the land spreading out before him, flat and golden and enormous under the Texas sky, and thinking that he was going to Abilene on the 14th of June to meet a woman named Margaret Finley who wanted to see the afternoon light. He fixed the porch first. He replaced 7 boards across the front and 1 along the side, and re-leveled the 2 steps that had been tilting since a particularly fierce storm in 1876. He painted the south wall of the house. He replaced the lamp wick. He scrubbed the kitchen floor on his hands and knees, a task he had not performed with any rigor in approximately 2 years, and he went through the spare room, which had been used primarily as storage for tools and old harness and miscellaneous items that had no other home. And he moved everything out and swept it and brought in the chest of drawers that had been in the barn for no good reason, and found a mirror that had belonged to his mother, and hung it on the wall and stood back and looked at the room and thought that it was decent. It was not fancy, but it was decent. Cody Price watched all of this activity with the expression of a young man piecing together a conclusion. He did not say anything for 3 days, which was a personal record, and then he said, while they were moving cattle from the south pasture to the north, "The spare room's looking real nice, Mr. Brooks." "It needed cleaning," Harvey said. "Sure," Cody said. They rode in silence for a while. "She arriving in Abilene?" Cody asked. Harvey cut him a sideways look. "I'm just asking," Cody said with entirely transparent innocence, "because if she's coming in on the stage I could go with you to help with the bags." "She's not bringing much," Harvey said. "She's a practical woman." Cody grinned broadly. "So she is coming." Harvey said, "Mind the cattle," and nudged General into a faster pace. But Cody's grin followed him all the way back to the house, and Harvey found that he did not mind it as much as he expected to. He arrived in Abilene on June 13th to give himself the full morning of the 14th, staying at a hotel that was clean enough and loud enough that he slept badly, and was awake before 4 in the morning lying on the narrow bed in the dark thinking, with the methodical precision that was his nature, about all the things that could go wrong. She could step off the stage and find him wanting. He could find her wanting. They could look at each other across the dust of an Abilene street and feel nothing but the flat disappointment of expectations meeting reality, and then they would have to figure out a polite way to undo an arrangement that had been made by letter and was therefore entirely theoretical. He had built a correspondence. He had not built anything more substantial than that. Letters were not real. Letters were constructed, considered, revised. The actual woman in the actual place would be different from the woman on the page, and he would be different too, and there was no letter in the world that could prepare either of them for that. He thought this very clearly and carefully at 4 in the morning, and then told himself to go to sleep, which he did not, and he was at the stage depot by 8:30, which was an hour before the stage was due, and he stood beside General and watched the street fill with the ordinary business of a frontier town in 1878. The freight wagons and the men on horseback, and the women moving along the boardwalks, and the smell of horses and dust, and something frying from the direction of the nearest saloon, and he was aware that his heart was beating at a pace that had no justification in his physical activity level. The stage arrived at 20 minutes past 9, which was on time by the generous standards of Texas stage lines. It came into the depot yard in a cloud of dust and a clatter of hooves and harness, and the driver called out to the horses and they settled, and the depot man stepped up to the door, and Harvey stood where he was and watched. 3 passengers descended. A man in a brown suit who had the stiff-legged gait of someone who had been riding a long way and was done with it. A woman of perhaps 50, with a large hat, who was collected by a man who embraced her, and then took her bag. And then the 3rd passenger stepped down, and Harvey knew it was Margaret Finley before he had consciously processed anything specific about her, which he could not explain and did not try to. She was of medium height and slight build, though the word slight did not quite capture it. She moved with the precision and economy of someone who was entirely comfortable in their own body, purposeful without being hurried. She had dark hair, almost black, pinned up under a small traveling hat of dark blue. She was wearing a gray traveling dress, practical and well kept, and she was carrying a bag in one hand and looking at the depot yard with an expression that was taking everything in, cataloging it, adjusting to it, and Harvey recognized that look because it was the look of someone who was not afraid to see things as they were. He walked toward her. She turned and saw him coming, and he knew she knew him, because Dorothea Sparks had apparently described him to her, and for once Dorothea's readiness to share information served a purpose. Her expression changed very slightly, and he could not quite read what crossed her face in that moment, but it was not disappointment, and that was something. "Mr. Brooks," she said when he was close enough. "Miss Finley," he said. They looked at each other for a moment in the direct, honest way that their letters had perhaps prepared them for, neither of them offering a social smile, just looking, just being seen. "You're taller than I expected," she said. "You look like your handwriting," he said, and then paused because that was a strange thing to say and he was already regretting it. She tilted her head slightly. "Is that good?" "Your handwriting is very clear," he said. "Precise. Doesn't waste space. I meant it as a compliment." The corner of her mouth lifted. It was not quite a smile yet, but it was the prospect of one. "That may be the most specific compliment I have ever received," she said. "I'm not much for compliments that aren't specific," he said. "No," she said, meeting his eyes. "I wouldn't think you were." He took her bag. It was heavy, which told him something about the woman, which was that she had packed books. He had specifically not packed books when he traveled because books were weight and weight was impractical, and he found that he was glad she had packed them. "Is this everything?" he said. "I have a trunk. I sent it ahead by freight to Calico Ridge. Dorothea said I could send things ahead." "You talked to Dorothea before you came?" "Extensively," she said as they walked toward General. She is not a woman who leaves details out. No, Harvey agreed. She looked at General, who was watching her with his characteristic expression of suspicion and assessment. She did not step back. She approached him steadily, let him see her hand before she offered it, and General, who had bitten a man named Jenkins in 1875 and knocked Cody Price off his feet twice, lowered his head and accepted her hand against his nose with an ease that Harvey found privately remarkable. "He's beautiful," she said. "He's mean," Harvey said. "He is also beautiful," she said firmly, and General seemed to agree with her assessment. Harvey thought that this was going to be all right. He had hired a second horse from the livery in Abilene so that she did not have to ride double, which would have been a practical disaster given the distance. The second horse was a calm gray mare named Dolly by the liveryman, and Margaret mounted her with competence that indicated she had done it before, settling into the saddle with an adjustment of skirts that was brisk and unsentimental. "You ride," Harvey said. "I grew up in Ohio," she said. "Before Philadelphia, my father had horses." "I didn't know that." "We had 2 months of letters," she said, gathering the reins. "There are things we didn't cover." "There are," he said. "I expect that's what time is for," she said. They rode out of Abilene in the mid-morning and turned south and west toward Calico Ridge, and the land opened up around them the way it did, vast and flat and breathtaking in the way that things can be breathtaking when they are so much larger than anything you expected that your scale of reference simply gives up trying to measure. Harvey watched her see it, the moment the town fell behind them and the prairie opened, and saw her face do the thing that the land sometimes did to people who were seeing it for the first time, the eyes going wider and the chin lifting slightly as though trying to take in more of it. "Oh," she said quietly. "First time seeing it like this," he said. "I've seen fields," she said, "in Ohio and parks in Philadelphia." She paused. "This is not a field." "No," he said, "it isn't." "It's enormous," she said. "Wait until we get further south," he said, "and wait until the afternoon." She looked at him with the directness she had on the page and in the flesh both. "The light," she said. "The light," he confirmed. They talked as they rode, and it was easier than Harvey had expected, though he had been the kind of man who would have told you he did not find conversation easy, which was perhaps only true with people he did not know. He knew Margaret Finley in some important ways, and the conversation had a shape to it that felt less like two strangers and more like two people filling in the spaces between things they had already established. She asked about the cattle, and he explained the current state of the herd and the challenges with the summer grazing. And she asked precise questions that revealed she had indeed read those agricultural pamphlets. He asked about the school year ending, and she described the last weeks of it with a dry clarity that was very like her letters, the final examinations, the parents, the new head mistress who had the warmth of a fence post. "Were you sad to leave?" he asked. She considered it genuinely, which he already recognized as her habit, not to give the automatic social answer but to actually consult herself on the question. "I was sad about the children," she said. "Some of them. The ones who needed it most, who sat in the front row and worked hardest because learning was the thing they had that nothing else could take away from them." She paused. "I was not sad about the rest of it. I think I had already begun to feel that it was time to go before I knew there was somewhere to go." "Where had you thought about going?" he said. Honestly, she looked over at him, the direct dark eyes steady. "Nowhere specific. I think I had thought about going in the abstract, the way you think about things you're afraid to actually do. I had a list." "What was on it?" "California," she said. "I thought about California. I thought about staying in Philadelphia and finding another school, but that felt like standing in place. I thought about going to St. Louis to be near my brother." She was quiet for a moment. "And then Dorothea's letter arrived with your name in it, and I sat in my room on a Sunday in March and thought, well, that is the most unlikely thing on the list, and I pulled out a piece of paper." "Why the most unlikely?" he said. "Because you had not asked," she said simply. "You did not want a mail-order bride, and it seemed to me that a man who genuinely did not want something was far more interesting to write to than a man who had placed an advertisement." At least I would know if you wrote back that it was genuine." Harvey was quiet for a while, processing this. "That's a very specific kind of logic," he said. "I am a specific kind of person," she said. They stopped at midday to water the horses at a creek that ran thin but clear through a shallow cut in the earth, and Margaret pulled a paper-wrapped bundle from her bag that contained bread and some cold sliced meat that she had apparently acquired in Abilene, because she was someone who planned ahead. And they sat in the shade of the only cottonwood tree within half a mile and ate. And Harvey thought that this was the first time he had eaten with someone in that particular spot in 12 years. Since a cattle drive in 1866 had brought a dozen men through, and one of them had played a mouth harp under this same tree while the others slept. "Tell me about the house," Margaret said, not for the first time, because she had asked him in letters too, but now the question was different, more immediate. "Tell me what it's actually like," he told her. He was honest about the fact that it was not large. 3 rooms. The main room with the kitchen and the fireplace and the table and the 2 chairs and the desk, the bedroom and the spare room where she would, he said carefully and without elaborating on what he meant by that word carefully, stay until they had decided on the nature of things. She nodded, following him, not filling the silence with social reassurance. He told her the summer would be brutally hot. He told her the nearest town was a 40-minute ride. He told her there would be days in the worst of the winter when getting to town would not be possible at all. He told her that Cody Price came 3 days a week and was a good worker and a terrible respecter of boundaries. He told her about the Dubois family next door, Hector and his wife Maria and their 5 children, who ranged in age from 3 to 14 and were generally underfoot. "Do the children go to school?" she asked. "There's a school in town," he said, "but it's far for the little ones." She said nothing to that, but something shifted in her expression that he filed away without comment. They arrived at the farm in the late afternoon, and the afternoon light was doing exactly what Harvey had written about, filling the enormous sky from one edge to the other with a gold so deep it was almost amber, laying itself across the flat land in long, warm bars between the shadows of the few trees, turning the dry grass to something almost precious. Harvey watched Margaret ride into that light and watched her stop her horse and simply look for a long moment, and he stopped too and said nothing. "You described it exactly," she said finally. "I tried," he said. "You succeeded," she said, and she looked at him across the golden air between them with an expression that was open and wondering in a way she might not have allowed herself if she had been thinking about it. And Harvey felt something settle in his chest, like a piece of furniture being set down in the right place for the first time. The farmhouse looked better than it had in years, which was due to his recent efforts, and he was glad of them when he saw Margaret look at it without flinching. She stepped up onto the new boarded porch and put her hand on the post and looked at the land behind them, back the way they had come, and said, "You can see forever from here." "That was the idea," he said. "My father built it to face west." "Smart man," she said. "He had his moments," Harvey said, and something in his voice when he said it made her turn and look at him with a quiet attention that was one of the things he was already learning to recognize about her. Inside, he showed her the house with the matter-of-fact brevity of a man who lived practically and knew it. The spare room he showed last, and it was adequate, and she stood in it and looked at the chest of drawers and the mirror on the wall and said, "Did you put the mirror there for me?" "It was my mother's," he said. A pause. "Thank you for that," she said. He made coffee and she looked at the kitchen with the careful eye of someone assessing a situation, and she did not say anything critical, but he could see her organizing it in her mind, thinking about how it worked and how it could work better. And he thought that this too was very like her letters. She did not complain. She assessed. Cody Price arrived the next morning at 6:30, which was earlier than Harvey had specified, and stood at the door with his hat in his hands and his eyes going from Harvey to Margaret and back to Harvey, with the energetic interest of a young man who has been waiting for this moment for weeks. Harvey introduced them with a brevity that discouraged commentary. Cody said, "It's a real pleasure, Miss Finley. with a sincerity that Harvey could not dispute, and then had the good sense to go directly to the work Harvey had assigned him. "He's very young," Margaret said, watching through the window as Cody headed toward the barn with the exaggerated purposefulness of someone trying to appear professional. "He's 20, Harvey said. "He'll improve." "He already seems quite good at it," she said. "He just needs to remember that the work matters more than the watching." Harvey smiled, which he did not always do so easily, and caught her noticing it. In the following 2 weeks, Margaret Finley settled into the farm with an efficiency and a naturalness that Harvey found himself watching at intervals throughout the day. She cooked better than he did, not extravagantly but well, with the practical inventiveness of someone who had learned to make good food from limited ingredients. She organized the kitchen in ways that made sense once he adjusted to them. She found the lamp that needed a new wick and replaced it on her second day, just as she had said she would, and set it on the table and looked at him with the quiet certainty of someone who keeps their word. She also made changes that were not practical but were nevertheless welcome. She planted 3 things along the east side of the porch from seed packets she had brought in her bag: verbena and sweet alyssum, and something she said was a Shasta daisy if the soil would take it. She hung a length of blue cloth in the spare room window that she had cut from a dress that had given up being a dress. She arranged the 4 books she had brought on the corner of the desk in a way that made them look intentional. He found he kept noticing these things, kept adjusting to the new presence of her in the house, in the yard, at the table, not unpleasantly. More in the way that he had felt on the first day that spring when the temperature changed and the air smelled different, the way your whole body says, "Something is shifting." They talked every evening. After supper and the dishes, they sat at the table, she on one side with whatever mending or reading she had, he on the other with whatever needed his attention, and they talked the way they had in letters but faster, and with the added dimension of expression and tone, the raised eyebrow when she was skeptical, the particular set of his jaw when he was working out what he thought about something before he said it. She called him on it directly one evening. "You do something with your jaw," she said, not looking up from the sock she was mending. "I do," he said, "when you are deciding what you think." "Probably," he said. "It's not a bad habit," she said. "Most people just say the first thing. You wait until you have something actual to contribute." She looked up then. "I like it." Harvey was not a man who blushed as a rule, but he was aware of something warm moving up the back of his neck. "I like that you say what you mean," he said, which was the truest thing he could have said in return. She smiled, a full one this time, and it changed her face in a way that did something entirely inconvenient to his thinking. There was a Sunday afternoon, 3 weeks into her being there, when they rode out together to check the north fence, which gave Harvey the excuse to show her the section of the property where the land dipped into a shallow draw and the cottonwood trees clustered along a dry creek bed, leaves silver green and always moving in whatever wind there was, the one piece of the property that had what he could only call atmosphere. He had never shown it to anyone. He was not sure why he showed it to her, except that he had been thinking about it since she arrived, thinking that it was the sort of thing she would want to see. She stood in the shade of the cottonwoods and listened to the leaves and said nothing for a long time, and he stood beside her and also said nothing, which was the most comfortable silence he had shared with another person in years. "Harvey," she said finally. It was the first time she had used his given name, and he felt it like a hand on his arm. "Margaret," he said. She turned and looked at him with that direct look she had, the one that saw things plainly and was not afraid to see them. "I want to ask you something honestly," she said. "All right," he said. "What do you want?" she said. "Not what you thought you wanted, not what is practical. What do you actually want?" He looked at her in the dappled light of the cottonwood shade, and the answer was already there, had been there for some time, clear as the creek that was not running today but would run again when the rains came. "I want you to stay," he said. He watched her take that in, watched the careful, precise woman who crossed out her fear and wrote it back in again take that in and hold it. "Not as the woman in the spare room," she said. "No," he said, "not as that." Harvey, she said, I need you to know that I did not come here with expectations. I came here because I wrote a letter and you wrote back and I found you to be a man I wanted to know, and that has turned out to be exactly true. I am not going to pretend I have not been thinking about this. Have you? He said. I have been thinking about it since approximately the Abilene Depot, she said, with a frankness that made him love her, and that was the word love arriving without announcement in his mind and settling there without apology. I want to court you properly, he said. I know the situation has not been conventional, but I want to do this right. She considered him for a moment, and then she said, with the particular dry wit that was one of his favorite things about her, Harvey Brooks, you have already read my letter 7 times and fixed the porch before I arrived. I rather think you have been courting me for some time. He blinked. How did you know I read it 7 times? She smiled, the full smile. Because you are thorough, she said, and because when you wrote back you answered things that were between the lines, not just the things on the surface. A man who reads something once doesn't catch what's between the lines. He stood with this for a moment and then he said, marry me. It was not flowery. It had no prelude beyond what they were already standing in the middle of. But it was exactly what it was, direct and true, the same as everything between them had been. She said yes, in the same spirit, and then she added, I will need a little time. How much time? He said. I have been here 3 weeks, she said. Give me until the end of July. Then yes. End of July, he said, and put out his hand, and she took it, which was the first time they had touched beyond the necessities of handing over bags and opening doors, and the feel of her hand in his, small but firm and dry and certain, was something he felt all the way up his arm and into his chest. They rode back to the farm in the late afternoon light, with something between them that was new and very much its own thing. The end of July arrived with a heat that settled over the land like a woolen blanket. The sky bleached to a pale blue that offered no relief, the cattle standing in the shade of the few trees in the south pasture, and expressing their displeasure in a low general chorus that Harvey could hear from the porch in the evenings. Margaret, who had been warned about the heat and had prepared herself for it as best a person could prepare for something they had never experienced, met it with the steady practicality she brought to everything. She wet cloths and kept them near. She cooked the heavier meals in the early morning before the day warmed, and in the evenings made things that needed little fire. She wore the simplest dresses she had and pinned her hair up tight. She also, Harvey noticed, checked on Cody Price's water supply without being asked, noticed that the man was working in the worst of the heat without adequate hydration, and began to bring an extra water jug out to where he was working in the mornings. Cody responded to this with a speechless gratitude that was more eloquent than anything he might have said. He had been telling Harvey for 2 years that he needed more water in the fields, and Harvey had been agreeing in the abstract and not acting on it, and Margaret had solved it in 3 days. Harvey told her this. She said, well, you were busy with 78 other things. He said, he thinks the world of you. He thinks the world of you, she said. I just brought water. She took to riding out with Harvey twice a week to check the herd, and she learned the cattle quickly, could identify each animal by individual characteristics in a way that Harvey had not expected, asking the names of the ones who had them and making up her own names for the others. He told her that the big brindle steer with the notch in his left ear had no name, and she said she was going to call him Senator because he looked pompous, and Harvey laughed so suddenly and completely that General spooked sideways. Toward the end of July, Hector Dubois appeared at the fence again, this time with Maria, his wife, a compact dark-haired woman of 35 who had been born in San Antonio and had the warm directness of someone who had no patience for pretense. Maria looked at Harvey and then at Margaret, who had come out onto the new boarded porch at the sound of voices, and Maria smiled with her whole face and said, in a carrying voice, "She is beautiful, Mr. Brooks, what were you waiting for?" Harvey said. "She's standing right there, Maria." "I know," Maria said, perfectly cheerfully, and turned to Margaret. "I am Maria Dubois. We are neighbors. I have been telling this man for 2 years he needed a woman with sense, and now here you are." Margaret descended the porch steps and shook Maria's hand and said, "He has more sense than he gets credit for," with a loyalty that struck Harvey somewhere very specifically in the middle of his chest and stayed there. The Dubois children, who had been hanging back behind their parents with the coiled energy of children waiting for permission to approach, were introduced and immediately took to Margaret with the instinct children have for people who genuinely like them. The oldest, a girl of 14 named Josephina, asked Margaret about Philadelphia with a hunger for information that Margaret met generously, sitting on the porch steps and talking about the city with the detail and warmth of someone who has both loved a place and outgrown it. Harvey sat inside and listened to all of this through the open door and felt the particular fullness of having something he had not known he was missing. They were married on the 31st of July, 1878, in Calico Ridge, in the small white church where Pastor Emmett Rowe officiated with the poorly concealed triumph of a man who had been praying for this outcome and was gratified to see it come to pass. Hector and Maria Dubois were witnesses. Cody Price was present and behaved with what Harvey thought was really admirable restraint, only grinning for the first half of the ceremony before settling into something approaching solemnity. Dorothea Sparks, who was very responsible for the whole thing and knew it, was in the front pew wearing a hat that was an extraordinary piece of millinery and crying openly from the moment Margaret walked in. Tom Sparks, who had known Harvey for 15 years and had never seen him wear an expression quite like the one he wore when Margaret came down the aisle of that small church, in a dress of ivory lawn that she had stitched herself in the previous 2 weeks from fabric that Maria had helped her find in Abilene, leaned over to Dorothea and said quietly, "I believe you were right about him." Dorothea dried her eyes and said, "I am frequently right, Thomas, and I appreciate you noticing." Margaret Finley, who became Margaret Brooks on the 31st of July, 1878, in front of Pastor Rowe and a small congregation of people she had mostly known for 2 months and already felt the beginning of something real with, said her vows in a clear, steady voice that did not waver, and Harvey said his in the direct, plain way he said everything. And when Pastor Rowe pronounced them married and Harvey took her hands, she looked at him with the same open, unguarded expression she had worn in the cottonwood shade, and he looked back at her with everything he had. They stepped out of the church into the bright heat of a Texas July afternoon, and the land spread around the town in all directions, flat and golden and enormous, and Margaret squeezed his hand and said, very quietly just for him, "I am very glad I wrote that letter." Harvey said, "I am very glad you wrote it 7 times better than most people write things once." She laughed, and he put her hand in the crook of his arm, and they walked toward where General and Dolly were hitched, and Cody Price cheered, which set off the Dubois children, and Dorothea Sparks wept again into an already thoroughly employed handkerchief. The first year of their marriage was hard in the ways that Harvey had told her it would be, and good in ways that he had not known to mention, because he had not known them before she arrived. The summer of 1878 came down on them with the full force of a Texas August, brutal and relentless, and they worked through it together, side by side, Harvey with the cattle and the fence lines, and the repairs that an old farmhouse always required, Margaret with the garden she had extended around the east and south sides of the house, fighting the heat and the dry soil with a tenacity that Harvey watched with admiration she deflected every time he expressed it. The garden produced. Not as abundantly as it would in better years, but it produced beans and squash and a crop of sweet potatoes that Margaret was privately more proud of than she let on. The flowers along the porch bloomed in the brief cooler weeks of late September and filled the air with something that had not been in that air before. Harvey came home one evening in early October to the smell of something baking and lavender from the porch flowers, and the lamp lit golden in the window, and he stood at the fence for a moment and looked at his house the way a man looks at something that has changed for the better so gradually that you only see it fully from a certain angle. Margaret noticed things about Harvey that had not perhaps been noticed before, or not with care. She noticed that he read widely and thought carefully, and she began bringing home books from the small lending library in town, which she had organized a subscription for herself and Harvey both, and they read in the evenings across from each other at the table and traded observations in the way that was entirely their own, a comfortable running commentary on whatever they were reading. She noticed that he was more generous than he appeared, that he had been quietly supplying credit to 2 families in the area who had hard seasons without advertising the fact, and when she mentioned it, he said flatly that it did not bear mentioning, which was of course the point. He noticed that she had begun, very quietly, to teach. It started with Josephine Dubois, who was bright and ambitious, and whose formal schooling had ended at 12, because the school in town was too far in winter and the family needed her. Margaret sat with Josephine on the porch 3 afternoons a week and gave her what she had, mathematics and grammar and history and literature, and Josephine absorbed it with the hunger of someone discovering that the world was larger than it had seemed. Within 2 months, Josephine's younger siblings began appearing on those afternoons, and then the children of 2 other families in the area, and then Margaret was teaching 8 children on the porch of the farmhouse, and had written to Harvey's satisfaction something that looked very much like a curriculum. He built her a proper room for it. He put it on the north side of the house, an addition that took him and Cody and Hector Dubois 3 weekends of November to complete, and he built in a blackboard wall and 4 proper desks from wood he had brought from Abilene, and Margaret stood in the doorway of it on the morning it was finished and was quiet for a long moment. "Harvey," she said, "it needs some finishing," he said. "The boards on the east side want a bit more caulking, and the window doesn't hang quite level yet." "Harvey," she said again. He looked at her face and stopped talking. She crossed the room and put both arms around him and held on, which was the best argument he had ever been presented with for the strategic importance of building rooms. "It's a good room," she said, against his shoulder. "It'll do," he said, and held her back. By spring of 1879, 12 children were coming to the farmhouse school 3 days a week, ranging in age from 6 to 15, and Margaret had applied to the county to have the school officially recognized, a process that required correspondence and persistence, both of which she had in abundance. Harvey assisted, not in the educational matters which were hers entirely, but in the bureaucratic ones, his directness with officials being, as Margaret noted, rather more effective than she had expected. "You are not a man they want to say no to twice," she told him. "I'm just clear," he said. "Exactly," she said. The school was recognized in June of 1879, making it the Calico Ridge Farm School, which Margaret thought was not a glamorous name but was honest, and she would take honest over glamorous every time. It was in the summer of 1879 that Margaret told him, one morning at the kitchen table over coffee, that she expected they would need to think about adding to the house again before winter. Harvey looked at her over his coffee cup for a moment and then set it down. "Before winter," he said. "February," she said, meeting his eyes with that direct gaze that he had read 7 times in a letter before he knew what it looked like in person. He was quiet for a long moment that was not empty silence but full silence, the kind full of everything. "February," he said. "I thought I should give you some time to get used to the idea," she said, with a carefully composed steadiness that he could see costing her something. "Margaret," he said. "Harvey," she said. "I have been used to the idea since the moment you walked out of that stage depot in Abilene," he said. "I am not sure I knew that's what I was getting used to, but I was." She blinked, very rapidly, twice, which was the closest she came to losing her composure, and then she smiled, the full one, the one that changed everything about the air in the room. Thomas Allen Brooks arrived on the 11th of February, 1880 in the farmhouse, delivered by a capable woman named Mrs. Agatha Crane, who served as Calico Ridge's midwife, and who told Harvey afterward that Margaret was the most composed woman she had attended in 30 years of the work, and meant it as the highest compliment. Harvey was not particularly composed himself during the hours of waiting, which he spent on the new boarded porch in the cold February dark, and Cody Price, who had ridden out that morning on some invented errand and then simply not left, sat on the step beside him and talked about absolutely nothing in the way that young men do when they are trying to be helpful and doing it wrong in a way that is nonetheless exactly right. When Mrs. Crane opened the door and said, "Mr. Brooks, you have a son," Harvey walked into the bedroom and stood at the bedside and looked at Margaret, who was tired in every visible way, and looked at him with eyes that were both entirely done with the day and somehow the most present she had ever been, and looked at the small wrapped person in her arms, and sat down on the edge of the bed because his legs had made a decision without consulting him. Thomas Allen Brooks was small and red, and had a great deal of opinions about being in the world, which he expressed immediately and at volume, and Harvey held him with the careful sureness of a man who had learned that some things you handle gently not because they are fragile but because they matter, and said nothing for a long time because there was nothing to say that was adequate. "Well," Margaret said, watching him hold their son, "you look like you've been used to that idea too." He looked at her over the top of Thomas's dark-fuzzed head, and felt everything very simply and very completely. "I love you," he said, which was not, given his nature, a thing he said carelessly, and she heard the weight of it and accepted it. "I know," she said, and then, "I love you too, Harvey." Thomas was a vigorous child who grew into a curious one, following his father around the farm from the time he could walk, and following his mother into the schoolroom from the time he could sit still long enough to watch, which was somewhat later. He had Harvey's steadiness and Margaret's precision, a combination that manifested as a child who thought things through with great thoroughness, and then announced his conclusions as though they were settled law. The school grew. By 1881, 20 children were enrolled, and Margaret had written to a teachers' college in St. Louis for materials and received them, and she had taken on a part-time assistant in the form of Josephine Dubois, who was now 17, and had blossomed under 4 years of consistent education into a young woman of formidable capability who was, with Margaret's strong encouragement, preparing to sit the examination for a teaching certificate. Maria Dubois cried when Margaret told her about Josephine's teaching certificate possibility. She sat at Harvey and Margaret's kitchen table and cried with the open-hearted generosity of a woman who does not apologize for feeling things completely. "She would not have had this without you," Maria said. "She would have found it," Margaret said firmly. "I just opened the door." "You built the room," Harvey said, which made Maria laugh through her tears and made Margaret look at him with the particular expression she wore when he said something she had not expected from him, which was an expression he worked with some effort to produce regularly. Hector Dubois had become a genuine friend over the years, which was a thing Harvey had not been expecting, given that the man raised sheep and had initially registered as a nuisance. But Hector was steady and honest and had a dry humor that came out unexpectedly in conversations, and he and Harvey had spent enough shared hours of fence repair and water rights negotiation and the general ongoing work of neighboring to have built something solid. And Maria and Margaret had become close in the way that two women become close when they are each other's nearest and best company, which on the frontier in 1880 was a closeness that went deep. The town of Calico Ridge changed over the years, as towns do, growing slowly in the way of frontier towns. A new mercantile, a doctor who arrived in 1881 and stayed, a telegraph office that Harvey considered a miracle of the age and Margaret considered practical, a proper school building in town eventually, in 1882, toward which the Calico Ridge Farm School had contributed significantly in both precedent and political pressure. Harvey had not thought, when he was mending fences alone in the spring of 1878, that he would find himself in the county commissioner's office arguing for school funding, but Margaret had been largely responsible for getting him there, and entirely responsible for drafting the argument he presented. And the outcome was a new schoolhouse in Calico Ridge that served the children of the town and left the farm school to serve the outlying families. Josephine Dubois earned her teaching certificate in the fall of 1882 and was hired as the schoolteacher for the new Calico Ridge schoolhouse, which caused Maria Dubois to cry again, this time with Hector also having some trouble with his eyes that he attributed to the autumn dust. Harvey said nothing but shook Josephina's hand with a gravity that made her stand up straighter, and Margaret embraced her and said, in her ear, "You did this. You understand that. This is yours." Cody Price, who had grown from a 20-year-old with too many opinions into a 25-year-old with appropriately tempered opinions and genuine skill, surprised everyone in the fall of 1882 by quietly marrying a young woman named Ellie Hart, who had come to Calico Ridge with her family from Kansas. He brought her to meet Harvey and Margaret with the shy pride of someone who has done a good thing and wants the people they respect to see it. And Margaret served coffee and pie and asked Ellie the right questions and listened to the answers with her full attention. And Ellie left the farm saying to Cody that Mrs. Brooks was the finest woman she had ever met, which Cody relayed to Harvey the next morning. Harvey said, "She is, without any qualification whatsoever." The summer of 1883 was good. The rains came right. The cattle thrived. The garden was extravagant in the way a garden is when everything aligns. And Margaret stood at the kitchen door on an August evening looking out at the land and the light and the flowers along the porch, and Thomas, who was 3.5 and had somehow gotten into the sweet potatoes again. And Harvey came to stand behind her and put his hands on her shoulders and felt her lean back slightly against him. "Are you happy?" he asked, because it was the question he came back to from time to time, needing to hear the answer. She was quiet for a moment in the way he knew, the way that meant she was consulting herself genuinely. "I'm happy in ways I did not know were possible," she said. "I'm happy about specific things and about the general shape of this life and about this land and this house and that ridiculous horse who ate my verbena." "General is sensitive," Harvey said. "He finds flowers soothing." "He finds eating other people's flowers soothing," she said. And then she turned around and looked at him with the full direct gaze that he had spent 5 years learning and was still learning. "Harvey," she said, "I need to tell you something again." "February," he said. She smiled slowly. "September," she said. He pulled her toward him and held her in the kitchen doorway with the August evening around them, and Thomas continuing his excavation of the vegetable garden in the middle distance. And he thought about a letter that had arrived on a Tuesday that he had not wanted and had read 7 times by lamplight, and about a woman who had crossed out her fear and written it back in again, because she was someone who told the truth, and about 312 acres that he had thought were complete and had turned out to be only the beginning. Ellen Rose Brooks arrived in the early hours of September the 22nd, 1883, quicker about arriving than her brother had been and equally vocal in her opinions, with Margaret's dark hair and Harvey's gray eyes, and a disposition toward decisiveness that appeared to be constitutional. Thomas regarded his new sister with the serious assessment of a 3-year-old who has considered the evidence and is reserving full judgment, and then offered her his wooden horse, which was the most valuable thing he owned, and Harvey saw that gift and thought that his son would be a good man. The farm school, which had graduated 12 of its students to the town school and continued to teach the outlying families, was in its 7th year now, a thing of the community, taken for granted the way good things become taken for granted when they persist long enough. Margaret had introduced a lending library of her own into the schoolroom, 12 books that circulated among the families, growing by 1s and 2s as donations came in, a copy of Dickens from Pastor Row, 2 volumes of natural history from the doctor, a dictionary that Dorothea Sparks presented with the ceremony of a woman donating a crown jewel. Harvey, in the winter of 1883, extended the north room by 6 feet to accommodate the growing library, and the fact that Margaret now had a proper writing desk in the school space where she prepared lessons and correspondence. He did the work on the evenings when she was occupied with the children and came to show her the completed extension one morning, standing in the doorway with sawdust on his coat, and she looked at the new space and the new shelving he had built for the books and turned to him with that open expression. "You keep building rooms for me," she said. "You keep filling them," he said. She crossed the new wooden floor and took his face in her hands, the hands that were no longer quite the schoolteacher's hands she had arrived with, that were now also the hands of a woman who grew sweet potatoes and delivered calves in emergencies and kneaded bread and tended the sick of the neighboring families, and she kissed him with the directness she brought to everything. "I am glad," she said against his lips, "that I wrote that letter. I am glad," he said, "that I read it. 7 times, she said. "Seemed necessary," he said. She laughed, and he heard it fill the new room, and he thought that this was what rooms were for. The years moved in the way that good years move, which is to say with a quickness that is only apparent in retrospect. Thomas grew into the farm with an enthusiasm that was gratifying, and a talent for working cattle that Harvey had not allowed himself to hope for, but found himself quietly proud of, watching the boy with the herd at 10 years old with a seriousness and a patience that was entirely recognizable. Ellen grew into the school with a ferocity that was entirely Margaret, sitting in the front row of her mother's classroom and working hardest because learning was the thing she had that nothing else could take away, which was something she had heard her mother say once and taken into herself as a principle. Cody Price and Ellie built a house of their own half a mile south of Harvey's property in 1885 and had their first child, a boy they named Harvey Cody Price, which Cody announced to Harvey one morning with a combination of pride and trepidation that Harvey thought was perhaps the most touching thing he had ever been presented with. He shook Cody's hand and said, "He'll need to grow into it," which Cody took correctly as the warmest possible acceptance. Hector and Maria Dubois expanded their flock and their house in equal measure, and Josephina Dubois taught in the Calico Ridge Schoolhouse for 31 years and trained 7 teachers who went on to schools across Texas, a legacy that had begun on the porch of a farmhouse on the northwest edge of town on a warm afternoon in 1879. In the spring of 1887, Harvey and Margaret sat on the porch, which had been repaired and repainted twice since the original work and now had a swing that Harvey had built and hung from the beam, and they sat in the swing in the late afternoon with Ellen, who was 3, asleep across their laps, and Thomas, who was 7, somewhere in the fields with General, who had mellowed considerably in his old age, and allowed Thomas liberties he had never allowed anyone else. The afternoon light was doing what it always did, filling the enormous Texas sky from edge to edge with gold that had no name in English as far as Harvey had ever been able to determine. "You should have been a poet," Margaret said, not for the first time. "I am a cattleman," he said, not for the first time. "You can be both," she said. "You just choose not to." "I write you letters," he said. She turned and looked at him with the expression that 5 years and then 9 years of being looked at had not made any less remarkable, the open, direct, entirely unguarded look that was only for him. "You write me very good letters," she said. "I learned from a good one," he said. The land stretched out before them in the golden afternoon, flat and enormous and endlessly itself, the cattle moving in the south pasture, the garden bright with late spring growth, the schoolroom quiet in the pause before another week's worth of children filled it with the particular music of learning. And Harvey put his arm around Margaret and she leaned into him and Ellen slept on across their laps, and the swing moved gently in the warm Texas evening. He had not wanted a mail-order bride. He had wanted nothing of the kind, had been very clear about it, had stated it to Hector Dubois and Cody Price and Pastor Rowe and everyone else who had raised the subject, which was everyone. He had been clear and settled and complete in his solitary life on 312 acres, clear the way a day is clear before the weather changes, clear in the way of not knowing what else might be possible. And then the letter arrived, on a Tuesday in April, in cream-colored paper in a hand that did not waste space, from a woman in Philadelphia who was afraid and said so because she was someone who told the truth. And he read it 7 times by lamplight at a kitchen table in the dark, and felt something move through him that he had not recognized because he had never felt it before. And he wrote back, because there was nothing else to do when something that honest arrived at your door, and she wrote back, and he wrote back again, and the world changed with the ordinary physics of 2 people choosing to know each other across a distance until the distance disappeared. He thought about all of this on the porch that evening, with the golden light on the land and his daughter asleep and his wife warm against his side. And he thought that a man could spend his whole life being very clear about what he did not want and never know what he was missing. And he was glad, deeply and specifically, and with the full weight of a man who does not use words carelessly, that he had read that letter 7 times and written back and gone to Abilene and put out his hand. Thomas came cantering back across the field on General, who moved with the proud economy of an old horse who is being ridden by someone he has chosen to tolerate, and pulled up at the fence and called out, "Papa, Senator got through the north fence again." Harvey looked at Margaret. Margaret looked at Harvey. "I told you that steer was trouble," Harvey said. "You told me he looked pompous," she said. "I said he was a senator. Those things are not mutually exclusive." He laughed, and the sound of it moved out across the flat land and the evening air and settled into the gold of the afternoon, and Margaret smiled with her whole face, and Ellen stirred and did not wake, and Thomas waited at the fence with General's ears pricked forward, and the farmhouse stood solid and whitewashed and alive behind them, with the flowers along the porch and the lamp waiting to be lit, and the schoolroom with its books, and the rooms that had been built one by one into something that was not a solitude but a world. Harvey stood from the swing, carefully, not waking Ellen, and Margaret took the sleeping child against her shoulder and watched him walk toward the fence, toward Thomas and General, and the north fence that needed mending and the pompous steer who had made his own decisions about borders. And she thought about a letter she had written on a rainy Sunday in March in a small room in Philadelphia, afraid and honest about it. And she thought about a man who had read it 7 times because he was thorough and because he caught what was between the lines. She had crossed out her fear and written it in again because she believed in telling the truth. She had written to a man who had made no invitation and left him the choice, entirely his, and he had made it, and here was the sum of it. 312 acres under a sky so large it made you reconsider the scale of everything, and a schoolroom full of books, and a bad-tempered horse who had made his peace with them both, and a daughter warm and sleeping, and a son growing into his father's steadiness, and a man walking toward the fence in the evening gold who would come back to the porch when the work was done and sit beside her, and say something plain that meant everything. She put her hand up and he turned at the fence and looked back at her across the yard, and she smiled, the full one, and he smiled back, the rare one, the one that changed the whole weather of a room. It was a good life. It was more than a good life. It was what happened when fear became courage, became a letter, became 7 readings, became a letter back, became a long ride south and west into a light that had no name in English, became this, all of this, the accumulated specific and ordinary and extraordinary weight of years, well lived together. Ellen Brooks slept against her mother's shoulder. Thomas Brooks learned the fence. Harvey Brooks, who had not wanted a May lord or bride, walked across his own land in the golden evening of a May day in 1887, and was exactly where he was supposed to be, and knew it. Senator the steer had gotten through the north fence and would get through it again, because some things you cannot entirely contain, and some people arrive in your life through gaps in the fence you did not know were there, and chain everything so completely that you cannot remember what the field looked like before, and you find in the end that you do not want to. Margaret watched the light go amber and then orange at the horizon and listened to the evening settle around the farm, the cattle and the breeze and somewhere the early insects beginning, and held her sleeping daughter and thought, yes, yes, This is exactly what I wanted, on a Sunday in March when I did not know yet that this was a thing I could want. The lamp inside needed lighting. She would light it in a moment. The night was warm and she was in no hurry, and Harvey would come back from the fence and they would eat supper and talk at the table as they always did. And Thomas would tell them about his day with the seriousness of a 7-year-old who considers his days worth reporting on. And Ellen would wake and want to be part of everything. And the night would come down over the land. And they would go to bed in the house that Harvey's father had built in 1861, that had new boards on the porch and a fresh coat of paint and a school room and a library and a swing and flowers that came back every spring. And they would wake before dawn because the work did not wait, and they would do it together. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything.